Not very far from here was the beginning of one of the saddest and most tragic stories in the Bible. For we are in the valley of Zorah. And one day in this valley, a lady was out in the field working when an angel of the Lord appeared unto her and told her that though she had been barren, she was going to bear a son. The angel warned her not to drink any wine or strong drink, because the child was to be a special child, and that when the child was born, no razor was to come to his head. She excitedly went home and told her husband of the visitation, and he cried out, "Oh God, please, let the man return and tell us just how we are to raise this child." And so again she was out in the field working, and the angel of the Lord appeared to her the second time in answer to Manoah's prayer, and she said, "Would you wait here a minute while I go get my husband?" And she ran and she got Manoah. And he came out and he said, "I just really want to know, how are we to take care of this child and what are we to do?" And the angel of the Lord repeated the instructions to him, just said, "The child is to be a special child. You're not to let a razor come to his head, and neither is he to drink any wine or strong drink or eat anything that comes from the vine." And so, according to the promise of God, the child was born. Samson was a man who had tremendous potential. A man whose life story is that of one who could have been, but he never was, because of the weakness of his flesh. Unfortunately, the story of Samson is repeated too often, as we see people who have tremendous and great potentials for being and for doing for God. And yet, unfortunately, though they have a tremendous potential, they never achieve or never attain because of the weakness of their flesh. And so Samson grew up around in this area, here in the valley of Zorah. And as he grew older, he went down to Timnath, an area of the Philistines. And there he fell in love with a young girl of the daughters of the Philistines. And he came home to his parents and he said, "I want you to go down and get me this girl for my wife." His father Manoah was quite upset. He said, "Oh, son, aren't there a lot of beautiful girls around Israel? Why do you have to go down there and fall in love?" And he said, "Dad, don't give me a bad time. Just go get her for me, that's all." Well, really, this was two mistakes that Samson made. The first one led to the second. The first mistake was going down to Timnath. You see, Timnath was the city of the enemy. It represented the camp of the enemy. And the minute you go down into the camp of the enemy, you are exposing yourself to some real problems. And so we find that after he had gone down to Timnath, the second mistake, he fell in love with one of the daughters of the Philistines. You say, "But Chuck, you can't help who you fall in love with." Well, I'm not against romanticism, but yet I realize that had he never gone to Timnath, he never would have fallen in love with one of the girls in Timnath, would he? So in a sense, you can help who you fall in love with. If you stay out of the enemy's territory, you're never going to fall in love with someone in the enemy's camp. But Samson insisted that his parents make the arrangements for the wedding, because in those days, marriage was by arrangement. And so he took his parents down to Timnath, and on the way, they got ahead on the path, and Samson, sort of lingering behind, a lion jumped out of the woods. And Samson grabbed the lion as though it had been a kid, and the Spirit of God came upon him, and he ripped the lion in two, and he tossed the carcass over in the bushes. They went on to Timnath, and the arrangements were made for the marriage. The dowry was determined, and The date of the wedding was set, and so later on, Samson and his parents were returning again to Timnath for the great wedding. As the parents again went ahead on the path, Samson got curious about that lion, and he wondered what had happened to the carcass, and so he went over in the bushes where he had tossed the carcass, and he looked at it, and he was surprised to see that the bees had made a hive in the carcass of the lion. And so he reached his hand in and got some honey and went down the road eating the honey until he caught up with his parents, and he gave them some of the honey to eat. And as they came to Timnath, the arrangements were made for the wedding. And in those days, weddings were different from the weddings today. Actually, it was really a big celebration. It lasted for a whole week. And so 30 of the young men of the Philistines were appointed to be Samson's companions during this week before the wedding, during the time of the partying and all. And so Samson said to the 30 fellows that were given to him for his companions, he said, I will give you fellows a riddle. And he said, if you can answer it, I will give you 30 shirts and 30 changes of garments. But if you can't answer it, then you've got to give me 30 shirts and 30 changes of garments. They said, what's the riddle? Samson said, out of the eater came forth sweetness. So the fellows started working on the riddle, thinking and working and thinking. They couldn't figure it out. And so they came to Samson's bride-to-be, and they said to her, you better find out what that riddle is about, or we're going to burn you and your dad's house with fire. These Philistine fellows were tough guys. They really weren't to be messed with. And so she came to Samson and she said, Samson, you know, you're holding back from me, and in just a few days we're going to be married, and you haven't told me what the riddle is. Now, Samson, you know, that's no way to start a marriage. We should not have any secrets from each other, Samson. And so, what is it that the riddle is? Samson said, hey, you know, I haven't even told my parents what the riddle is. But daily she wept and just pressed him until Samson said, oh. He said, on the way down to Timnath, I killed a lion, and the bees made a hive in the carcass, and I got honey out of the hive, and so out of the eater there came forth sweetness. There's nothing to it. And so the day of the wedding came, the big ceremony. And so Samson said to these 30 fellows, okay, fellows, what's the riddle? And they said, what is stronger than a lion? And what is sweeter than honey? Oh, Samson got mad. He said, if you guys had not been plowing with my heifer, you'd have never found out. And he took off, went down to one of the neighboring Philistine cities and grabbed 30 of the Philistines and knocked their heads together, took their shirts and their clothes, and came back and paid his debt and took off again for home. Didn't even go into his new bride. Oh, after a while he cooled down, and so he went back down to see her again at Timnath, and he started into the room, and her daddy said, wait a minute, you can't go in there. And Samson said, why? I'm married to her. And he said, no. He said, when you left, you were so angry, I thought you just hated her completely, and thus I let the best man marry her. And so he said, but after all, her younger sister is prettier than she is. Why don't you take the younger sister? Samson said, no way, I'll have nothing to do with that. And he was angry. He went out and caught 300 foxes, and he tied them tail to tail. And then he lit torches and tied them to the tails of these foxes and turned them loose in the ripe fields of wheat. Just burned up the wheat fields, just destroyed the wheat crop and the harvest there of the Philistines. And of course, that was their turn to get angry. He had taken off again for home, and the Philistines gathered together a garrison of men to go get Samson. And so as they came to the land of the Israelites went out to meet them and said, what's wrong? Why are you guys down here? We don't want to fight you. What's the matter? And they said, well, we're after Samson. If you'll turn Samson over to us, we'll let you alone. And so they came to Samson, who was just resting up on the hillside, and they said, Samson, Don't give us a bad time. You know how tough those Philistines are, and we're in no condition to fight them. And they said, now you've been down there and you've created trouble, and the guys are up here ready to fight us. We don't want to fight them, and they want us to turn you over to them. And Samson said, well, I'll make you a deal. He said, you can turn me over to them if you'll promise me that you won't turn on me yourself. And they said, we don't want to hurt you, and we have nothing against you, except you're just creating a lot of problems for us. And so Samson allowed them to bind him with ropes and turn him over to the Philistines. And then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson, and he broke those ropes like they were just nothing, and he saw a jawbone of a donkey. He picked it up, and he began to smite the Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey, tossing their bodies into heaps, until finally he destroyed the entire garrison. And he looked down these heaps of bodies round about him, probably somewhere in this area. And he said, heaps upon heaps. I've killed 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. You'd think that Samson maybe would learn his lesson, staying out of the enemy's camp, but no. The next time we see Samson, he's on his way to Gaza, and there he goes into the house of a prostitute. And the Philistines, seeing him come within their city, locked the gates. And they said, let's wait, and as soon as he tries to escape tomorrow, we'll ambush him and kill him. Well, about midnight, Samson decided to go home. And he came to the gates of the city and found them barred and locked. And he picked up the gates with a post and carried them on his shoulders from Gaza all the way to the hill that is before Hebron, almost 20 miles. And he tossed them aside on the hill. The next morning, when the men of Gaza came to catch Samson, they were amazed to find the gates and the posts of their city were gone. And they had to go clear on over to Hebron to get them back. Again, you would hope that maybe Samson would learn his lesson, that he began to use that strength that God had given him for good purposes, but such was not to be the case. For now we are told that he fell in love with one of the daughters of the Philistines, whose name was Delilah. And the Philistines came to her and said, if you'll find the secret of this man's strength, we will each give you several pieces of silver. And so Delilah started working on Samson, and she said, oh, Samson, you're so big and you're so strong. Oh, Samson, every time you flex, it just does something to me. What is the secret of your strength? And Samson said, oh, he said, well, I'll tell you what, if they would bind me with new ropes, I'd be weak just like anybody else. You see, they've always used old ropes when they've bound me. Notice the question, what is the secret of your strength? How the enemy is trying to discover the secret of your strength. In the book of Job, we read that the sons of God were presenting themselves to God, and Satan also came with them. And God said to Satan, where have you been? He said, oh, I've been cruising around the world. And God said, have you observed my servant Job? A man who is perfect and upright, loves good, hates evil. The word God used in talking to Satan, have you observed, is a word in the Hebrew that means to study and scrutinize carefully. It's really a picture of a general who is ready to attack a city. And so he studies it to develop the best strategy for attack, looking for the weakness, looking for the place where he might attack the city to destroy it. Have you observed carefully, studying in order to attack? The thing is, Satan had been studying. He's looking for the secret of strength in your life. You say, well, Samson was great, he didn't tell her. But wait a minute. It was really sort of a compromise. You see, at that point, Samson should have said, it's none of your business the secret of my strength. Or could have just told her, I've dedicated my life to God. But it would be hard for him to tell her that because of the lifestyle that he had chosen and the fact that he was in the enemy's camp. A lot of times we have invitations to do things that we know are not right. Maybe we've just had a real commitment of our lives to Jesus Christ, or a recommitment of ourselves, and someone calls up and says, hey, there's a real party going on tonight. Come on over, we're going to really have a great time. And you know that the things that are going to be going on at that party are things that you shouldn't be involved with, and so you say, well, I'm not feeling too good tonight. I don't think I can make it. You think, oh, great, I got by. No, you see, you compromise. You weren't really honest with the situation. If you just come right out and say, hey, no, you know, I've just recommitted my life to Jesus Christ, and I just don't want to do things like that anymore because really I found such joy in the Lord. I don't need that anymore. You'll find out that that'll be the end of it. Your friends will never call you again. But if you compromise, say, oh, I've got a headache tonight, I don't think I can make it, then you're just opening the door for the next invitation. And how long before you are brought right back into the old pit? And so we find that Samson lied to her, a little deception, but it was a compromise. And so she bound him up with ropes when he was asleep, taking a nap. She said, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And he jumped up and the ropes popped off like they were threads that had been burned in a fire. And he went out and destroyed the Philistines. And so she said, oh, Samson, you were just teasing me, weren't you? You're so cute. My, you're such a clever fellow. But really, Samson, what is the secret? Tell me, what is the secret of your strength? And he said, well, I'll tell you, if they would ever buy me with green vines that had never been dried, I'd be weak just like anybody else. And so she had him take another nap, and she had them bring in the green vines, and they tied him up. And she cried, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And he jumped up, and the vines popped off, and he went out against the Philistines. And so she came again and said, oh, Samson, you're so funny. You really, you know, you're really quite a guy. But what is truly, now, come on, be honest, what is the secret of your strength? And Samson said, well, my hair. Oh, watch out. My hair, if they would braid it in 7 braids. Oh, all right. You didn't give in, Samson, good boy. I would be weak just like anybody else. And so she again has him take a nap while she just lets him lie there on her lap, and she takes and braids his hair in 7 locks, and then for good measure they spike it into the floor. And she cried, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And he jumped up and pulled the floor up with him. The floor beams came up with him. Went out against the Philistines. Well, she finally pulled the ploy that women usually pull when they can't get what they want any other way. She began to cry and say, oh, you don't really love me. You're just making a fool out of me. You're telling me all these lies. How can you say you love me when you lie to me so much? What is the secret of your strength, Samson? And he said, well, they've never cut my hair from the time I've been born. And so this time she realized that he had opened up and told her all that was in his heart. So she said, why don't you go to sleep, Samson? And as he was sleeping, she called in a barber who shaved his head. And she said, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And he said, I'll jump up like I did before and go out against them. And the tragic verse there, it says, he knew not that the Spirit of God had departed from him. He wasn't aware that he had lost that power. He had been compromising, fooling around so long until he came to the place that there was no power, and yet he didn't realize it. It was gone. I see so many people that way today. The Spirit of God is no longer working in their lives, but they don't even know it. That's the tragedy. The Philistines came in, they grabbed him, they wrestled him down. Someone took a stick and jabbed out his eyes. They took chains of brass and they bound him, and they led him off to Gaza. And there they tied him to the millstone. They put the ox off and they put Samson on, and he pushed this pole, pushing the millstone around the trough so the ladies could come and grind their flour. And so we see a mighty man, a strong man, a man who could have been a tremendous power for God. We see him as he's blinded. We see him as he is bound by the chains of brass. We see him as he pushes the millstone, grinding day after day. What an apt picture that is of the effect of sin within a person's life. First of all, sin blinds you. Blinds you to the truth about your own condition. You think, oh, everything's all right. It's cool. I've got it made. I don't have to worry. Don't worry about me. I can handle it. But you're blind to the fact that you're so weak and helpless. The next thing that sin does is that it binds you. Brass is always a symbol of judgment as far as metals are concerned. And there's Samson bound with brass. And I think of the binding power of sin. And finally, we see him as he's grinding away there at the mill, and sin ultimately begins to grind in your life. That which was so exciting and so pleasurable to begin with soon becomes monotonous, and you find yourself just grinding day after day. But you don't know how to escape it. You don't know how to get out of it. You say, oh, Chuck, that happened over 3,000 years ago. What does that have to do with us today? Plenty. The story isn't 3,000 years old. The story is being retold every day. I meet so many young people. As I look at their lives, I think, what a potential they have for God. What a power for God they could be. What talents and abilities God has endowed them with. And if they would only use them for the Lord, what a mighty power for God they could be. But I see them wasting these potentials. I see them messing around in the enemy's camp. I see them compromising with the truth. I see them as they are making horrible mistakes with their own futures. And I think, oh God, can't they see what they're doing? Can't they see what is happening? But they know not that the Spirit of God has departed from them, and they're getting deeper and deeper as sin begins to bind them. What a tragedy. When you see potential, you see what a person could be, but he isn't, because he has not kept control of his flesh. How many people have been defeated because they didn't conquer their own flesh? The story of Samson is a tragic story, even more tragic because it is being repeated so often. But that is not the end of the story. We are told that the Philistines were having a big celebration, and they all gathered together in their temple. And they decided to bring Samson in order that they might make sport of him. The man that had once been such a terror to them, the man whose name struck terror within their hearts, is now a blinded slave. Let's bring him in so we can just laugh at what's happened. And so they brought Samson into the temple where they were sporting and worshiping their God. And Samson said to the little boy who led him in, "Would you lead me over to the pillars that hold this building up?" For you see, the scripture says his hair began to grow again. There is the sign of the grace of God. Though Samson had messed it up, blown it, yet God was still gracious. His hair began to grow. Now, I want to make one thing clear. What was the secret of Samson's strength? You say his long hair? No. That's superficial reading of the scripture. His long hair was only a sign of his consecration to God. The secret of his strength was his consecration to God. Any man who consecrates his life to God is going to be strong. But the moment you break that consecration, you're going to be weak, just like other men. But God was gracious. His hair began to grow. And Samson bowed his head and said, "God, once more, just once more, avenge my eyes upon these Philistines and give me your strength. Let me feel your spirit working and surging in my life just once more." And we are told that Samson took hold of the pillars and he bowed himself with all of his might. And the Spirit of God came upon him, and those pillars caved in, and the temple crumbled, and 3,000 Philistines were crushed to death. And beneath the pile, Samson, the man who could have been, but wasn't, because he broke his consecration to God. May that not be the story of your life. May you make your commitment to Jesus Christ, and may you keep your commitment to Jesus Christ, that you can attain the full potential of your being as you give that which God has given to you back into His hands, that He might use it for His glory.